So a couple things that we got to go over and review before we get going here. So this is kind of what we went over the other day. I know some of you classes saw a little bit more, depending upon if you were in here for the SIP day or not. So quick reminder of the equation for a sine function. So the whole thing looks like this. Y equals A times the sine of B in parentheses x minus h. Outside of parentheses were K. Now, the only things that we really cared about yesterday were A. And remember, if A was negative, that meant that the graph reflected. Also, A was the amplitude of our graph. Okay, so there wasn't anything to do. It was just known that, and when we worked with A, it told us which direction the graph went, and it also told us what the amplitude was, which remember is the distance from the midline to the min or the max. Now K, speaking of midline, is the midline value. Okay, so in parentheses put Y equals K because remember a midline is exactly that, a line. So K, like 5, is not a midline. Now Y equals 5 is a midline. Okay, so don't forget about that. So those are three big focuses that we have right now. So the positive or negative, whether it's reflected or not, the amplitude, and then the midline. So knowing what we just learned, take a look at what we have here. So we want to find the midline, amplitude, and if the graph's reflected or not. Okay, so remember the midline deals with this value out here. So remember it is a line, so it must be Y equals 5. Whereas now all we're going to work with is A. So the amplitude, remember, is always going to be a positive number. It's just the distance from wherever the midline is to where our min and max are. Now the sine of A, that tells us that's if it's reflected or not. And because that sign is negative, that means that it is reflected, meaning that it's going to go down first. Okay, so now another example here with the midline. Okay, so that is a -2, so we just have to make sure that we apply that sign in the equation there. Amplitude here, okay, it is a fraction, but fractions are numbers too. It's just going to be 3/4. And then finally, this is a positive number, so there's nothing in front, so this is not going to be reflected, meaning that from 0, the graph is going to go up instead of down like the last one. Now, just because there's nothing out here doesn't mean a midline doesn't exist. This is the same thing as saying plus is 0. Okay, if I add 0 to something, nothing changes. And we always need to know where our midline's at. So our midline is just, in this case, is just Y equals 0. Okay, once again, the amplitude, even though it's negative, is still going to be just a +4. And then out here, we do have a negative number, meaning that, yes, this is going to be reflected. Okay, so once again, that's going to go down there. And last but not least, we have this 3 out here. So Y equals 3. We don't have a number here. So once again, this time we're multiplying. So if you tell me that it's a 0, that means that this doesn't exist because anything times 0 is 0. But it is here. So remember, this is going to be a 1. Okay, when we multiply, to keep it the same, we multiply by 1. And then this is going to be reflected because, once again, we have a negative number out there. Now, I went through that kind of quick because I'm hoping a lot of you guys remember this stuff. You guys seem to do pretty well on this Wednesday, excuse me. So hopefully we remember all this. If you need to stop it or pause it or anything, ask a friend, ask a neighbor. Feel free to do so, but make sure you understand where all this information came from here. All right, so again, what we're working with is Y equals A sine of X plus K. Now there's more to it, but right now that's all we really care about. Okay, so remember, this is going to give us, these are the two things that might change within our equation. So we're going to start out here, Y equals, now the first thing we need to know is the sine of A. And this is not telling us that it's reflected, so that's going to be a positive sign. Now remember, A stands for amplitude. Okay, so our amplitude is 3, so we're going to have 3 times the sine of x, and then we just take whatever the sign is out here. Since that's a -3, we're going to subtract 3. That's all we have to do. We're done at that point. And the next one, Y equals, now remember the first thing we got to look for is a sign, and this is reflected, So that means that that's going to be a negative sign. Okay, it doesn't tell us our amplitude changes, so it just stays 1, so negative sign of x. And it doesn't tell us that our midline has changed, so that would just be plus 0, which once again we don't have to write. So the only thing we have for this second one is negative sign of x. Okay, the negative tells us reflected and nothing else has changed. Next one, y equals. Okay, once again it's not reflected, so we're just going to keep a positive number there. The amplitude here is 4, so a goes out front. Sine of x, that's a positive 2/3, so plus 2/3. And once again, we're done at that point. And the last one. Okay, so we got a little bit of everything here. Y equals reflected, so it's going to be negative. Amplitude, a out in front, is 5. Sine of x, and then y equals negative 4, so we have to make sure that we subtract 4 at the end there. Here we're still finding the midline amplitude and if it's reflected or not, but now we're given the graph instead of all the information. Okay, so a couple things how we want to start this. When we're looking for the midline, we want to add the max point, so the highest point, plus the lowest point, and then divide that by 2. Okay, so in this case we have our highest point at 2, our lowest is at negative 2. So we're going to do 2 plus negative 2 divided by 2. 2 plus negative 2 is 0, and 0 divided by 2 is 0. Now remember, once again, that means y equals 0. Now the amplitude, we can do the max point that we just found minus the midpoint or midline value. Okay, don't divide that. I don't know why I drew that line. So in this case, we have 2 minus 0, which is just going to give us 2. Okay, and we can see that with this being our midline, we go up 1, 2 units, and we're at our max, or we go down 1, 2 units, we're at our min. Okay, so that's what an amplitude is. This distance right here, so you can kind of visually see it now. And then finally, if it's reflected or not. So when we start our graph starts going in the positive direction. Okay, starting at 0, so that means that it is not reflected. Okay, if it were going down, that would mean it is reflected. Okay, so let's try a couple more here. So we have a max at 3. We're going to add that to our min at negative 5. And divide that by 2. So 3 plus negative 5 gives me negative 2 divided by 2, which gives me negative 1. Which gives me a midline at y equals negative 1. So right here. Now, amplitude, you can do one of two things when you're given the graph. We can go 1, 2, 3, 4 units. Up, check it, 1, 2, 3, 4 units down. Or we can take 3 and subtract our midline value, negative 1. When you subtract the negative, you add, and we get 4. Okay, so either way you do it, you'll end up with the same answer there. Once again now, when we start this graph at 0, it's going upwards, meaning that it is not reflected. Okay, so a couple different things to look at and way to visualize it there. Okay, so a few more examples just so we get used to it a little bit. Max is at 1, min's at negative 5. 1 plus negative 5 divided by 2 gives me negative 4 divided by 2 gives me negative 2, so y equals negative 2. So right here is my midline. Okay, so we'll use the math this time. Our max is at 1 minus negative 2. Subtract the negative, we add, so that's where that comes from. There's the 3. And then finally, once again, the graph is going upward, so no, this is not reflected. And one more. So this one, we can see that we're at negative 0.5 plus, and then our lowest one's down here at negative 1.5. And divide that by 2, which is going to give us negative 2 divided by 2. get us -1. So y equals -1. So it kind of cuts right through there. All right, highest point, -0.5 minus 1 gives us 0.5. Sorry, minus -1. That's where I was getting confused at. Okay, which means we get 0.5, and then once again, from our 0 point, the graph is going up. So again, it is not reflected. All right, so the other day I didn't give you any step-by-step instructions, so we're going to do that here. So I'm just going to start with what our graph is going to look like. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find, based on the equation, the midline, amplitude, and if our function is reflected or not. So our midline here, you can see that we got that +1 at the end, so we get y equals 1. Our amplitude then is that number up front. So our amplitude is 3. And we can see here that this is going to be reflected because of that negative number. Okay, so we got a lot going on in this problem. So we found everything we wanted to find. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to draw the midline. Okay, so our midline is at y equals 1. So if this is 0, we're going to go up 1. We're going to extend that line out. Next, we're going to find the max and midpoints, and we're going to do that by taking the midline value plus the amplitude gets us the max, and then to get the min, we're going to do the midline minus the amplitude, which will give us the min. Okay, so if this is at 1, we're going to take 1. Our amplitude means we're going to go up 1, 2, 3. So 2, 3, 4. 1 plus 3 gives us 4. And then we can subtract 3 or go down 1, 2, 3 units to -2. Okay, so we're subtracting 3 to get to the bottom. We're adding 3 to get to the top. All right, now there's 5 points that you're going to use today. Those points are 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Okay, in that order. So 0 starts right here, nice and easy. And then we have pi over 2, and we have pi, and we have 3 pi over 2, and finally 2 pi. So I am going to backtrack for a second. We got pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Now, in our standard y equals sine of x graph looks like this. Our max is at pi over 2. At pi, we're back at the midline. We're at -1 at 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. So my graph looks like that. Okay, so a max here, a 0, a min here, a 0, and we start at 0. Now, that's not based at 0, that's based at our midline. Okay, so instead of writing zeros here, let's write midline. Because that midline can move, as we saw. So when we're at 0, we're on the midline. When we're at pi over 2, we're at the maximum point, so in this case 4, and that is wrong because it's reflected. So since it's reflected, this point's now going to be down on the bottom here, so at -2. At pi, we're on the midline again. At 3 pi over 2, we are at a minimum, but because it's reflected, that minimum now becomes the maximum at 4. And then at 2 pi, it's on the midline again. So that's what this graph looks like. That point should not be there. Okay, so that's how you determine the value. Okay, so knowing that at 0 we're on the midline, at pi we're on the midline, at 2 pi we're on the midline. Pi over 2 is a max unless it's reflected, and 3 pi over 2 is a min unless it's reflected. Then they switch spots. Okay, so we're going to do a couple examples of these on the next couple slides, so bear with me if you don't understand it. See if you can pick up where you're getting lost at. Okay, try to watch one more and then maybe pause and see if you can do it and check your answer as you go. Alright, so step 1, we want to find our midline. We're going to get y equals -1. Our amplitude is 2. And this is not reflected because that's a positive number. So now we're going to graph that midline. So we're at 0, we're going to go down to -1. And there's our midline. We need those points that we know how to graph. So that's going to be pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So we'll put those on our 0, and then we have 0. Okay, now with this amplitude, that means we're going to start from our midline and we're going to go up 1, up 2. So our max is going to be at 1, and we're going to go down 1, down 2, to -3. So since this is not reflected, we're going to start on our midline, and then at pi over 2, we're going to go to our highest point, which is at 1. At pi, we're going back to the midline. 3 pi over 2, we're going to the minimum, in this case -3, and then 2 pi, we're going back to the midline. So you should always have 3 points right now that are going to be on this line, on your midline. Okay, and that's going to be at the beginning, the middle, and the end. These 2 points, you have to determine if you're reflected or not. Are you going to be high or low? Let's try one more here. Again, if you think you get it, okay, pause and see if you get it right. If you're still getting pretty lost, make sure you follow along. Again, stop and start the video as you need to. Midline, we got y equals 2, comes from right there, it's +2. We have an amplitude of 1/2. Remember, it's just the value because what the sign tells us is that this is going to be reflected. So, first things first, y equals 2, we go up 1, up 2. And make sure you label these points because they're all going to look pretty much the same. We got to make sure you know what the values are everywhere. Pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi. Alright, those are my 5 points. Now, my amplitude here is only 1/2. So that means from this line, I'm only going to go 1/2 in each direction. So 2 minus 1/2 gives me 1.5. 2 plus 1/2 gives me 2.5. We're going to start on our midline. This is reflected now, which means that pi over 2 is going to be my lowest point. Pi is still in the midline. Pi over 3, which is normally my lowest point, is now going to be my highest point. And then 2 pi is going to be right on the midline as well. So this one's going to be a little skinnier because our amplitude is only 1/2 as compared to the 2 that it was over here. Okay, so midline, amplitude, reflected or not, graph the midline, plot your 5 points, okay, and then determine where your min and max are.